Today we are not here to diagnose, blame, or romanticize pain. We are here to listen to it, to understand why certain hearts keep finding the same kind of distance dressed up as destiny. When an empath repeatedly attracts an avoidant, it is not bad luck, weak boundaries, or being too much. It is a nervous system remembering something familiar. Long before we learn language, the body learns what love feels like, what safety costs, and what must be sacrificed to stay connected. Many empaths learned early that attunement to others was the price of belonging, while their own needs were something to manage quietly. Avoidants, on the other hand, learned that closeness was unpredictable or overwhelming, so distance became protection. When these two meet, it feels magnetic, even spiritual, because it echoes unfinished emotional business. This dynamic is not about attraction alone. It is about survival strategies mistaking each other for love. If we can see this clearly without shame, something begins to loosen inside us, and awareness becomes the first act of compassion toward ourselves. An empath does not fall in love with absence by accident. The pull toward an avoidant is often the pull toward what the body already knows. The nervous system is not designed to seek happiness, it is designed to seek familiarity. If early relationships were inconsistent, emotionally distant, or required the child to be vigilant and attuned to others, then intensity mixed with uncertainty becomes encoded as connection. Later in life, when an avoidant appears warm one moment, distant the next, the body recognizes the rhythm. This recognition is often mistaken for chemistry, fate, or deep love, but it is memory operating below awareness. For many empaths, being emotionally perceptive was not a gift that emerged in comfort, it was a skill developed in response to emotional scarcity. The child learned to read subtle shifts in tone, mood, and presence because attunement was necessary to maintain connection. Over time, this sensitivity becomes identity. Being needed feels meaningful, being chosen feels earned. When an avoidant withdraws, it activates the old belief that love requires effort, patience, and self-abandonment. The empath stays not because the relationship is nourishing, but because leaving would mean confronting the terror of disconnection that once felt life-threatening. Avoidants are not villains in this story. Their distance is also a memory. Often, closeness once meant intrusion, control, or emotional overwhelm. So the avoidant learns to regulate safety through space. Independence becomes virtue. Need becomes weakness. When an empath moves closer with care and concern, the avoidant initially feels soothed, even admired, but as intimacy deepens, the old alarm sounds. Withdrawal is not rejection, it is self-protection. And paradoxically, this withdrawal intensifies the empath's attachment, because it mirrors the original one of reaching for someone who is not fully available. This dynamic persists because it resolves nothing while feeling deeply compelling. The empath believes that if they can just love better, give more, understand deeper, the distance will finally close. This belief is rooted in a childhood fantasy that connection can be secured through self-sacrifice. The avoidant believes that if they maintain enough space, they can stay safe without being consumed. Both are acting from adaptive strategies that once made sense. The tragedy is not the attraction itself, but the unconsciousness around it. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar peace because peace requires a new identity. For the empath, choosing someone emotionally available can feel strangely dull or even anxiety-provoking. There is no chase, no uncertainty to manage, no role to play. Without the task of earning love, the empath may feel lost, exposed, or undeserving. The nervous system equates calm with emptiness because it was never trained to rest in mutuality. In this way, the avoidant becomes a mirror that reflects the empath's deepest conditioning that love is something you work for, not something you receive. Awareness begins when the empath pauses and asks not why do they pull away, but what part of me feels at home in this distance? This question is not self-blame, it is self-inquiry. It invites compassion for the younger self who learned that closeness required vigilance. As this compassion grows, the nervous system slowly learns that safety can exist without pursuit, that connection does not have to be activated by longing or fear, and that love does not require the abandonment of the self. Empathy, for many people labeled as empaths, did not begin as a choice or a gift, it began as a necessity. In early environments where emotional stability was inconsistent, the child's nervous system adapted by becoming exquisitely sensitive to others. This sensitivity was not about kindness at first, it was about safety. When a child cannot rely on caregivers to be predictably present, the child learns to monitor emotional cues closely. A sigh, a change in posture, a shift in tone could signal danger or disconnection. Over time, this constant monitoring becomes automatic, and what began as vigilance is later called empathy. Because this empathy developed in response to uncertainty, it carries a hidden belief that relationships are something to be managed. The empath learns that harmony depends on their ability to anticipate needs, soothe tension, and prevent emotional rupture. Love becomes conditional upon performance. The child internalizes the idea that their value lies in how well they can regulate others, not in being fully themselves. As adults, this shows up as over-responsibility for other people's emotions and a chronic neglect of one's own internal experience. When such a person meets an avoidant, the dynamic activates this survival-based empathy instantly. The avoidant's subtle distancing, emotional ambiguity, or mixed signals become cues that demand attention. The empath feels compelled to understand, to be patient, to adjust. This feels meaningful, even purposeful, because it mirrors the original role the empath learned to play in childhood. Being with someone emotionally available would require less emotional labor, and paradoxically, that can feel unsafe because it removes the familiar structure the empath relies on to feel connected. Survival-based empathy is deeply intertwined with self-suppression. The empath often learned that expressing needs led to disappointment, dismissal, or emotional withdrawal, so needs were minimized, postponed, or translated into caretaking. Instead of saying, "I need closeness," the empath offers understanding. Instead of saying, "I feel hurt," they search for explanations for the other person's behavior. This creates an imbalance where the relationship revolves around the avoidant's comfort, while the empath's inner world remains largely unacknowledged. Avoidants often respond well to this kind of empathy at first because it does not challenge their defenses. They feel accepted without being required to fully show up. The empath's patience and emotional insight can temporarily bypass the avoidant's fear of intimacy. But as the relationship progresses, the empath's unspoken needs begin to surface, not as clear requests but as exhaustion, resentment, or emotional distress. This is when the avoidant feels pressured even if no explicit demands are made, because the emotional undercurrent shifts. The tragedy of survival-based empathy is that it disconnects the empath from their own body signals. The nervous system becomes oriented outward, scanning for others' states, while ignoring internal cues of fatigue, sadness, or unmet needs. This disconnection makes it difficult for the empath to recognize when a relationship is harmful. Red flags are intellectualized, explained away, or reframed as opportunities for growth. Pain is normalized because pain was once the price of connection. This form of empathy also creates an unconscious hope that if the empath can finally be seen, chosen, and prioritized by someone emotionally distant, it will retroactively heal the original wound. The avoidant becomes a symbolic stand-in for earlier figures who were unavailable. Winning their closeness feels like redemption. But this hope keeps the empath locked in a pattern where love is pursued rather than shared, and presence is negotiated rather than given freely. Healing begins when empathy is no longer used as self-erasure. True empathy includes the self. It recognizes that understanding another's pain does not require tolerating neglect or emotional absence. When the empath begins to listen inwardly with the same care they offer outwardly, the survival strategy slowly loosens. The nervous system learns that connection does not have to be earned through vigilance, and that being attuned to oneself is not selfish, but essential for real intimacy. Avoidance is often misunderstood as indifference, selfishness, or a lack of care, but at its core it is a strategy of protection. It develops not because someone does not value connection, but because connection once felt overwhelming, intrusive, or unsafe. In early life, when a child experiences closeness that is unpredictable, emotionally chaotic, or demanding beyond their capacity, the nervous system adapts by creating distance. This distance is not emotional coldness, it is regulation. It is the body learning how to survive intensity by reducing proximity. For the avoidant, intimacy is associated with loss of autonomy. Closeness once meant being engulfed by another person's needs, moods, or expectations. The child may have learned that there was little room for their own inner world, that emotions were not welcomed unless they were convenient, or that love came with pressure. As a result, the nervous system equates dependence with danger. Independence becomes safety. Self-reliance becomes identity. Emotional distance becomes a way to breathe. As adults, avoidants often appear calm, rational, and self-contained. They may value freedom, logic, and personal space. These qualities are often praised, which further reinforces the pattern. But underneath this composure is a nervous system that becomes activated when emotional demands increase. When someone seeks closeness, reassurance, or vulnerability, the avoidant may feel a sudden internal pressure without understanding why. This pressure is not conscious fear, it is a physiological response rooted in earlier experiences where closeness overwhelmed the system. When an empath enters this dynamic, the contrast is striking. The empath moves toward connection to regulate, while the avoidant moves away to regulate. The empath's desire for emotional depth can feel to the avoidant like a threat to their internal balance, even when it is expressed gently. The avoidant may not articulate this fear. Instead, it shows up as withdrawal, distraction, intellectualization, or a sudden focus on work, hobbies, or personal goals. Distance restores a sense of control. Avoidance is reinforced by relief. Each time the avoidant creates space and feels calmer, the nervous system learns that distance works. Over time, this becomes automatic. The avoidant may genuinely care, miss the other person, or feel drawn to intimacy in moments of safety, but as soon as closeness deepens, the old alarm activates. This creates a push-pull pattern where connection is allowed only up to the point where it triggers overwhelm. Beyond that point, retreat feels necessary. Many avoidants are unaware of this process. They often believe they simply have high standards, need the right partner, or are not ready for commitment. In reality, readiness is not about desire but about capacity. The capacity for intimacy depends on whether the nervous system can tolerate closeness without entering a state of threat. When that capacity was never developed in childhood, adulthood relationships become a constant negotiation between longing and self-protection. This is why avoidants are often drawn to empaths. The empath's attunement feels soothing at first. There is no immediate pressure to perform emotionally, no demand to fully reveal. The empath adapts, waits, and understands. This creates a sense of safety that allows the avoidant to approach. But as soon as the empath's needs become more visible, even subtly, the avoidance system interprets this as the beginning of overwhelm. Withdrawal follows not as punishment but as regulation. Avoidance also protects against dependency. Many avoidants fear that if they allow themselves to need someone, they will lose themselves. This fear often comes from early experiences where dependence was not met with care, but with control, neglect, or instability. So the avoidant learns to minimize needs altogether. They may struggle to identify what they feel or want, because turning inward was never encouraged. Emotional numbing becomes another layer of protection. The cost of avoidance is disconnection from vulnerability. While distance reduces overwhelm, it also limits intimacy. The avoidant may feel lonely even in relationships, yet unsure how to bridge the gap without losing safety. This internal conflict can create confusion, guilt, or a sense of inadequacy. They may believe something is fundamentally wrong with them for not being able to stay close, without recognizing that their system is doing exactly what it learned to do. Understanding avoidance as learned protection changes the narrative. It removes moral judgment and replaces it with compassion. It also clarifies why empaths cannot heal avoidance through patience or love alone. No amount of understanding can override a nervous system that perceives closeness as danger. Healing requires awareness, safety, and the slow retraining of the body to tolerate intimacy without collapse or retreat. Until then, avoidance will continue to appear not as a choice but as a reflex. Long before we have words for attraction, the nervous system is already making decisions. It scans for what is known, not for what is healthy. This is why people often find themselves in the same relational patterns despite conscious intentions to choose differently. The mind may want security, consistency, and mutual availability, but the body is drawn to what feels familiar. Familiarity is not comfort, it is recognition. It is the body saying, I know how to survive this. In early life, repeated emotional experiences shape neural pathways that define what connection feels like. If love was paired with unpredictability, emotional distance, or effort, the nervous system wires those qualities into its template for relationships. Later, when encountering someone who evokes similar sensations, uncertainty, longing, emotional tension, the body reacts with activation. The heart may race, thoughts become preoccupied, and attention narrows. This state is often labeled as chemistry or attraction, but it is actually the nervous system entering a known pattern of arousal. The mind often arrives later with explanations. It rationalizes the body's pull by assigning meaning to the other person's traits, potential, or wounds. The empath may believe they are drawn to depth, mystery, or complexity, without realizing that what truly attracts them is the emotional environment their body already recognizes. This is why emotionally available people can feel unexciting or even unsettling. Their consistency does not activate the old circuitry, so the nervous system remains calm, and calm is unfamiliar. This process operates beneath conscious awareness. The nervous system does not consult values, intentions, or self-esteem. It responds automatically based on past conditioning. When an avoidant pulls away, the empath system becomes activated in a way that feels urgent and meaningful. Attention locks in. The desire to restore connection intensifies. This is not a flaw of character. It is a conditioned response to perceived threat of disconnection. The body is attempting to regulate itself by reestablishing closeness. The avoidant's nervous system is running a parallel process. When intimacy increases, their body interprets this as a threat to autonomy or safety. Stress hormones rise and withdrawal brings relief. Both systems are responding intelligently to their own histories, yet their strategies are incompatible. One moves toward to regulate, the other moves away. The push-pull dynamic is not a failure of communication, it is a clash of survival responses. Because these responses are automatic, insight alone is often insufficient to change the pattern. An empath may understand intellectually that the relationship is unhealthy, yet still feel a powerful pull to stay. This is because the nervous system does not respond to logic, it responds to experience. Without new experiences of safe reciprocal connection, the body continues to default to what it knows. This is why people can repeat the same relationship story with different partners, believing each time that this one will be different. The nervous system also confuses intensity with intimacy. High emotional activation creates a sense of importance and urgency. Waiting, longing, and uncertainty amplify focus and emotional investment. This can feel like deep connection, but it is actually heightened arousal. True intimacy, which is steady and mutual, does not produce the same spikes. For someone conditioned to equate love with activation, this steadiness can feel empty or even anxiety-provoking because the body does not yet know how to rest there. Healing requires retraining the nervous system, not just changing beliefs. This begins with awareness of bodily responses rather than stories about the other person. When attraction arises, noticing whether it is accompanied by anxiety, urgency, or self-abandonment offers valuable information. These sensations are signals, not commands. Over time, as the body experiences relationships where closeness does not require vigilance and distance does not threaten survival, new pathways can form. The nervous system learns through repetition. Each experience of being seen without effort, of expressing needs without consequence, of staying connected without chasing or withdrawing, slowly rewires the definition of safety. As this happens, attraction shifts. What once felt boring begins to feel nourishing. What once felt exciting begins to feel destabilizing. The body starts to recognize peace not as absence but as presence, and connection no longer has to hurt in order to feel real. Overgiving is often mistaken for generosity, but at its root it is a strategy to secure connection. For many empaths, giving more than is sustainable did not begin in adulthood. It began when love felt uncertain. When attention, care, or approval were inconsistent, the child learned that staying emotionally relevant required effort. Giving became a way to remain visible. The nervous system absorbed the belief that connection is fragile and must be maintained through usefulness, availability, and sacrifice. As adults, this shows up as a reflex to offer more whenever distance appears. When an avoidant pulls back, the empath does not pause to ask whether the relationship is meeting their needs. Instead, they instinctively increase investment, more understanding, more patience, more emotional labor. This feels loving, but beneath it is anxiety. The giving is not free, it is driven by the fear that if they stop, the connection will disappear. Love becomes something to earn rather than something to receive. Over-giving also creates a subtle power imbalance. The empath becomes the emotional container of the relationship, holding space for both people while minimizing their own needs. This can feel noble, even spiritual, but it comes at a cost. The empath's inner world slowly disappears from the relationship. Needs are delayed. Boundaries soften. Resentment builds quietly. The avoidant may not ask for this level of giving, but they adapt to it. The relationship organizes itself around the empath's capacity to carry more. For the empath, over-giving provides a sense of purpose. It creates meaning and uncertainty. When love feels unstable, effort offers the illusion of control. If I give enough, understand enough, stay long enough, then the relationship will stabilize. This belief is deeply rooted in early experiences where the child felt responsible for emotional harmony. The empath learned that love was not something that happened to them, but something they made happen for others. Avoidants often respond ambivalently to overgiving. Initially, it feels soothing. There is less pressure to show up emotionally because the empath fills the gaps. The avoidant feels accepted without being required to fully engage. But over time, this dynamic becomes constricting. Even unspoken needs can feel heavy when someone is giving from depletion rather than abundance. The avoidant may feel guilt, pressure, or a vague sense of being indebted, which activates their instinct to create distance. Over-giving also disconnects the empath from truth. When the focus is on maintaining connection at all costs, honesty becomes threatening. The empath may avoid expressing disappointment, loneliness, or anger because these emotions risk destabilizing the bond. Instead, pain is reframed as understanding. Hurt is turned inward. The empath becomes emotionally fluent in explaining others, but less fluent in naming their own experience. This self-silencing reinforces the original wound, that their needs are too much. There is also an unconscious hope embedded in overgiving. The empath may believe that one day their effort will be recognized, that the avoidant will finally see how much has been given and respond with closeness. This hope keeps the empath invested long past the point of mutuality. The relationship becomes a project rather than a partnership. Love is measured not by reciprocity, but by endurance. The body pays the price for this pattern. Chronic overgiving leads to exhaustion, anxiety, and emotional numbness. The nervous system remains in a state of vigilance, constantly scanning for signs of withdrawal or approval. Rest feels unsafe because rest removes the strategy that once ensured connection. Even when the empath is depleted, stopping feels more dangerous than continuing, because stopping confronts the fear of being unchosen. Healing begins when giving is no longer used as currency for love. This does not mean withdrawing care or becoming cold. It means allowing giving to emerge from fullness rather than fear. When the empath begins to notice the impulse to give more in response to distance, and pauses instead of acting automatically, a new internal experience becomes possible. The nervous system slowly learns that connection does not depend on self-erasure, and that love offered freely must also be met freely to be real. Emotional unavailability is not just the absence of presence, it is the presence of an old wound. For many empaths, the pull toward emotionally unavailable people is not about rejection, but about recognition. It awakens a familiar longing that began in early life, when love was sensed but not consistently received. The child felt the caregiver's importance deeply, yet could not reliably access their emotional availability. This created a state of wanting without receiving, hoping without certainty, reaching without resolution. This unresolved longing becomes embedded in the nervous system. It does not disappear with time, it waits for a similar emotional landscape to reappear. When an emotionally unavailable partner enters the picture, the old longing is activated. The empath may feel an immediate sense of depth, connection, or significance, not because the partner is offering presence, but because the situation mirrors the original emotional environment. The longing itself becomes mistaken for love. Emotionally unavailable people often offer intermittent connection. There may be moments of warmth, insight, or intimacy followed by withdrawal. These moments are powerful because they echo the rare times the empath felt seen in childhood. The nervous system latches onto these highs, investing heavily in the hope that they will become permanent. Each moment of closeness feels like progress, even if it is followed by longer periods of distance. This pattern keeps the empath emotionally engaged while never fully satisfied. The empath's longing is not irrational, it is rooted in an unmet need for attunement. As a child, expressing this need may not have been safe or effective, so it remained unspoken. In adulthood, the emotionally unavailable partner becomes the stage on which this need is unconsciously replayed. The empath is not just seeking connection in the present, they are seeking repair of the past. If this person finally becomes available, it would symbolically heal the original wound of being emotionally unseen. This dynamic often leads the empath to overinterpret minimal gestures. A text, a moment of vulnerability, or a brief display of care can feel profoundly meaningful. The nervous system, starved of consistency, amplifies these signals. The empath may ignore the larger pattern of absence and focus on these moments as proof of potential. This selective attention is not denial, it is hope shaped by early deprivation. Emotionally unavailable partners often sense this longing, even if unconsciously. They may feel valued, idealized, or deeply important without having to offer sustained presence. This can reinforce the imbalance. The empath invests emotionally, while the unavailable partner maintains distance without fully disengaging. The relationship exists in a suspended state fueled by longing rather than mutual engagement. Longing can feel like depth because it is intense. It occupies the mind and body. It creates meaning and purpose. For someone whose early relationships were defined by waiting and hoping, this state feels familiar, even alive. Mutual, consistent availability may feel flat in comparison, not because it lacks depth, but because it does not activate the old ache. The nervous system confuses the absence of longing with the absence of love. The cost of this pattern is chronic emotional hunger. The empath may feel perpetually close yet alone, connected yet unseen. They may blame themselves for wanting too much, not realizing that their needs are entirely human. Emotional unavailability keeps the empath oriented toward the other person, constantly monitoring for signs of closeness, while remaining disconnected from their own emotional nourishment. Awareness begins when the empath distinguishes longing from love. Love is not the ache of waiting to be chosen, it is the experience of being met. When the empath recognizes that the intensity they feel is tied to old deprivation rather than present intimacy, the spell begins to loosen. The nervous system can then start to grieve what was missed, rather than chasing it through unavailable others. And the heart slowly learns that being emotionally seen does not have to be earned through longing. Boundaries often feel threatening to empaths not because they are wrong, but because they were once associated with loss. In early relationships where emotional connection was fragile, asserting a boundary could lead to withdrawal, disappointment, or rupture. The child learned implicitly that closeness depended on accommodation. Saying no, expressing limits, or prioritizing personal needs felt dangerous because it risked disconnection. Over time, the nervous system paired boundaries with abandonment. As adults, this conditioning persists beneath awareness. When an empath considers setting a boundary, the body may react with anxiety, guilt, or fear. These reactions are not signs of selfishness, they are memory responses. The nervous system anticipates the old outcome: distance. This is especially activated in relationships with avoidants, where closeness already feels precarious. The empath senses that any assertion of need could push the other further away, reinforcing the belief that boundaries are incompatible with attachment. Avoidants, on the other hand, often experience boundaries very differently. Their boundaries are not about protecting connection, but about protecting space. Distance regulates them. When an empath finally sets a boundary, it can feel unfamiliar or even threatening to the avoidant, not because boundaries are inherently problematic, but because the relationship has been organized around the empath's flexibility. A new limit disrupts the unspoken agreement that the empath will adapt and absorb. For the empath, the absence of boundaries can feel like loyalty. Enduring discomfort becomes proof of love. This endurance is often praised or romanticized, reinforcing the pattern. But what is actually happening is a slow erosion of the self. Without boundaries, the empath's needs remain unexpressed, their limits unacknowledged, and their emotional life subordinated to maintaining connection. Attachment security is sought through self-sacrifice rather than mutual respect. Boundaries also threaten the empath's identity. If one's sense of worth has been built around being understanding, available, and accommodating, then saying no can feel like becoming someone unlovable. The empath may fear that without their adaptability, there is nothing left to offer. This fear is not narcissism or neediness. It is the residue of early experiences where love was conditional on performance. In avoidant empath dynamics, boundaries often expose the truth of the relationship. When the empath stops over-giving or tolerating distance without protest, the avoidance response becomes clearer. Some avoidants may withdraw further, unable or unwilling to engage with the discomfort of mutuality. This withdrawal can feel devastating to the empath, but it also provides information. It reveals whether the connection was sustained by reciprocity or by self-erasure. Healthy boundaries are not ultimatums. They are expressions of self-connection. They communicate what is needed to remain present without resentment. But for empaths, learning this requires retraining the nervous system to tolerate the possibility of loss. It means discovering that connection maintained at the expense of the self is not secure, even if it feels familiar. True attachment includes the capacity to remain connected while honoring limits. As boundaries are practiced, something unexpected often happens. Anxiety may rise at first, but over time, self-respect grows. The empath begins to experience themselves as an active participant rather than a caretaker of the bond. This shift can feel destabilizing, especially if the relationship has relied on imbalance. But it also creates the possibility of relationships that are not held together by fear of abandonment. Boundaries do not destroy attachment, they clarify it. They reveal whether connection can survive truth. When an empath learns that being authentic may lead to loss, but being inauthentic leads to emptiness, the nervous system slowly recalibrates. Attachment security begins to form not from constant accommodation, but from the knowledge that the self is allowed to exist within connection without disappearing. Healing does not begin by fixing others, it begins by reclaiming responsibility for one's own inner world. For empaths, this can feel counterintuitive, because responsibility was often learned as taking care of others. From an early age, attention was directed outward, toward managing emotional environments and maintaining harmony. The self became secondary. Returning responsibility to the self is not abandonment of care, it is a correction of imbalance. In empath-avoidant dynamics, much of the empath's energy is spent interpreting, accommodating, and waiting. The focus remains on the avoidant's moods, availability, and potential for change. This outward orientation creates a sense of purpose, but it also delays healing. As long as the empath's well-being depends on the other's behavior, agency remains external. Healing requires shifting the question from, why are they like this, to what am I feeling and what do I need right now? This shift can be uncomfortable because it brings the empath into direct contact with unmet needs, grief, and anger that were previously managed through understanding others. Taking responsibility for the self means allowing these feelings to exist without immediately translating them into explanations or compassion for someone else. It means recognizing that pain does not have to be justified by another person's wounds in order to be valid. When responsibility returns to the self, patterns become clearer. The empath begins to notice how often they override internal signals in order to preserve connection. Fatigue, anxiety, and disappointment are no longer dismissed as personal weaknesses, but understood as messages from the body. Listening to these messages is an act of self-trust. It marks a transition from survival-based relating to conscious choice. Avoidance cannot be healed through empathy alone, because healing is not a cognitive process, it is a nervous system process. Similarly, empaths cannot heal by continuing to adapt. Responsibility for one's own healing means accepting that no amount of patience or love can create safety in another person's body. This acceptance is not resignation, it is liberation from the illusion of control. As the empath takes responsibility inward, the dynamic changes. There is less chasing, less explaining, less waiting. Not as a strategy, but as a natural consequence of self-attunement. The nervous system begins to orient toward internal regulation rather than external validation. Calm is no longer dependent on the other's availability. This creates space for discernment. The empath can now feel the difference between longing and compatibility, between intensity and intimacy. Responsibility also includes grieving what was never received. Many empaths bypass grief by staying in relationships that recreate the original wound. Taking responsibility means allowing the grief to surface without immediately trying to repair it through another person. This grief is not weakness, it is a completion. It acknowledges that something essential was missing, and that the longing for it was reasonable. As grief is felt, the compulsion to repeat the pattern begins to loosen. The nervous system no longer needs to seek familiar pain to validate the past. Instead, it becomes open to new experiences of connection that do not require self-sacrifice. Responsibility to the self creates a new reference point, safety that comes from within, rather than from being chosen by someone unavailable. Healing is not a dramatic transformation, it is a gradual return. A return to the body, to boundaries, to needs, to presence. When responsibility is no longer outsourced to the hope that someone else will change, the empath reclaims authorship of their emotional life. From this place, relationships are no longer arenas for survival but spaces for mutual recognition and shared humanity.